Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. On the agenda tonight we have Stanley Jordan, and Stanley's going to be playing through his version of Stairway to Heaven. So let's get Stanley up on screen and see how he gets on. I'm just going to jump in here as the bass and drums start to join in, because the way that Stanley's playing, you obviously have noticed, he's just tapping all the time here. So getting some sustain on the string to begin with, he doesn't have that luxury of being able to pick the string whilst fretting a note. He's literally tapping in all of these notes. So in order to hear them, he's got to come down with quite a force in order to get those notes to sound. On his guitars, they're actually made with a really low action. I mean, when I say really low, I'm talking about 0.5 millimeter. If you can imagine that action, it's almost touching the fretboard, which then opens itself up to then being tapped on, so it makes it a little bit easier, but even still. But also the fact that he's got to be so accurate with that right hand. Sometimes when he's kind of looking at the crowd, you think that if there's any style that you need to look at the fretboard with, it is tapping. And Stanley's just so cool when he plays. His background, or at least his preference, is jazz. He does a lot of jazz playing. So playing something straight like this, you start to hear those little jazz elements that come in. And it's interesting to look at this video after last night's video, which was Michael Hedges, because they're both using similar techniques, tapping down onto the fretboard. Of course, Michael was on an acoustic guitar, but it just goes to show how you can have one technique, but then you can have two totally separate artists who make their music sound totally different. So with the guitar, it's such a versatile instrument that even if you take one technique, two people can make it sound totally different with their own style. And I don't think it will surprise anyone to know that Stanley actually started playing piano first at age 6, and he did that for 5 years, and then he moved over to guitar and just kept exactly the same style by tapping down onto those strings. Obviously, technically, it's a lot more difficult on the guitar because you don't need to smack the fingers down on a piano. You'll always get the right note, the right sound. You won't get any buzzing from a key. Whereas here, there are so many pitfalls when you're tapping onto a string on guitar in order to keep it really nice and clean. Another thing that Stanley does so well is get that legato sound from his runs, because when you're tapping onto strings on the guitar, as soon as you let go of the pressure on that string, it will just die. So if you're only tapping on, in order to get that legato sound, it means that Stanley has got to maintain that pressure for as long as possible on that fretboard before moving on to the next note. And those notes have seamlessly got to follow each other whilst keeping connection to that fretboard the whole time. So he's absolutely got that down, because he can get such smooth, cool runs, even though he's playing these runs with the right hand. And the ability that he's got with these runs with the right hand is super impressive when you just think it's all hammer-ons and pull-offs. He does do occasional downstrokes, which you'll see, in order to get that root note and the lower E string, obviously. But for the most part, it's all tapping with that right hand and playing the chord with the left hand. So we've got these two parts combining. You've got that melody with that right hand being tapped in, whilst the chords are being changed with the left hand. So again, getting two parts on one guitar. Let's get stuck into a little bit more. And there we go. I thought I'd let it go until the end because we had just a little bit more of the performance to go. But getting into his playing with that right hand, like I mentioned before, that dexterity of the right hand is exactly the same as most players have with the left hand. Of course, the difference with Stanley, as we saw there, he actually has got exactly the same ability with both of his hands because he was playing octaves with the left hand and the right hand just together, combining those together in runs towards the end. So we got a really cool sound there. This way of playing, of having the hand coming over the top of the neck of the guitar, you might have seen before with players with a guitar laid flat on their lap. Jeff Healey, for example, who was a blind guitarist who played this way, and he'd have that left hand over the top of the guitar, but he still used a pick in that right hand and his fingers, so he was getting the sustain from that right hand. Whereas Stanley, through choice here, is choosing to tap in those notes rather than pick them. It'd be great to see Stanley actually use a pick, because the ability that he's got in that right hand as well, he'd be able to put together some insane tapping sequences by starting off with a pick to get that sustain and then just using that sustain with hammer-ons and pull-offs, and you'll get a really great legato sound. He already does here without even that luxury of a pick. Towards the end of that lead section, we can see Stanley tapping in on the high E string and the high B string. Of course, if you play guitar, you'll know that tapping on those thinner strings and getting a decent sound is a lot more difficult because there's no weight to the string, because they're a lot thinner. Whereas on that low E, A and D string, because they got a bit more weight to them, you can tap and get a decent sound onto the fretboard without needing to use that right hand to pick it first. So tapping on those low strings is easy, but getting a decent sound from these really thin strings up at the top like the high E string is so much more difficult, let alone getting a run together like Stanley does. So really impressive there. I say the high E string and B string, whereas it's not actually true on Stanley's guitar, because he tunes it to C and F on the B and the E at the top. So he says it just makes more sense to do that. And I have to agree with Stanley on this one. If you do play guitar, you'll know that that high E string and B string are tuned differently to the previous strings, so that you have to make that half step adjustment as you're moving up if you're playing through a scale or you're playing through any particular shape. Whereas the way that Stanley tunes it in perfect fourths, it means that he can just go up and down the fretboard and not have to worry about that little shift up if he needs to get to that B string in the E string, because it's now a C and an F string effectively. So why make your life even more difficult when you could just tune your guitar a little bit more differently and then open yourself up to so many more techniques and make the style that you're playing a little bit easier to handle. So an interesting take by Stanley on the classic Stairway to Heaven, and not only artistically but technique-wise as well. But thank you so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!